Good afternoon. I'm Gary Stennett, Cat Burt, the EVIL HR Director, Associate Vice Chancellor for HR. Welcome, and hopefully we'll have a few more that will come in. But for those that aren't here, we are recording this presentation, and Christy Jackson will have it up on our website, along with these survey results. Thank you for participating in the survey. We had the highest response rate in the UNC system at 71% against the UNC average of 50%, so that was definitely a strong indication of interest in participating. And I know the Chancellor's very happy about that also. It was in February that we took this survey, and it's been a fair amount of time since then. Part of the reason for the delay has been a request by the UNC General System Office, I still occasionally want to call it General Administration, to not get out ahead of the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors got their first look at the data on Tuesday, October the 9th. You may recall that this comes from a mandate from the board that falls out of the UNC strategic plan. And there were 5 or 6 different themes of activities in the strategic plan. One of those deals with human capital and some other issues and relates to doing engagement surveys over the course of 5 years. And so in February of 2018, we did the first year, and the results that you're going to get are our campus results for the first year of the survey. It will be done again in 2020, and then it will be followed a third time in 2022. To help administer this, UNC System Office engaged a consulting group known as Modern Think, and we have with us today Rich Boyer, who is one of the founding partners of Modern Think and their senior consultant. And for those of you who are familiar with the Chronicle of Higher Education Great Colleges to Work For program, this is the group that partners with the Chronicle of Higher Education on that piece. Rich is, again, the senior consultant with Modern Think. It's a consulting group out of Wilmington, Delaware, and they focus on employee engagement, organizational behavior and dynamics. And so without further ado, I'll let Rich walk us through the results. There will be an opportunity at the end for questions, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate that. Glad to have a chance to be with you all here today. And this is, we've got a relatively full deck, a presentation that I want to get through, a lot of data that I want to share, but I also want to make sure that we've got time for Q&A. So we'll definitely carve out some time for questions at the end. If you've got a question that's really pressing in the course of our conversation as we're talking about data, please don't hesitate to give me a signal and I'll try and address that as I'm able. I want to build on what Gary was saying just here a minute to provide a little bit more context in terms of our approach to this process and how we look at our data. Most folks who do know about Modern Think know about us as a function of our work with the Chronicle. We work with lots of colleges and universities and even systems outside of the scope of that, so we're not wedded just to that project alone. Today we've surveyed about almost 1,400 different colleges and universities across the country over the last 10 years. So this is kind of what we do. 90% of our practice is in higher ed, looking at issues related to workplace quality, organization culture, and faculty staff engagement. So as you hear me share about trends that we're seeing or best practices, that's kind of the lens through which I'm looking at this. I've had a chance to essentially do the same presentation with your cabinet this morning. As Gary was mentioning, there's been essentially kind of a timed rollout. This information was embargoed until it got presented to the board last week. And most of the other institutions in the system are somewhere along the same process that you all are in right now. Over the last 2 weeks, I've been to almost half the campuses in the system, either supporting or doing similar presentations. So y'all are kind of right where most folks are at this point in the process. Let's talk about this instrument before we go right into results. It is a diagnostic tool. It's an assessment tool. It gives us insight into the health of the culture at a particular point in time. As Gary mentioned, administration of this survey was the last of January and most of the month of February. So that's kind of the window that we're looking at. I would also suggest a survey like this is a communication tool. We go into great effort, and you all have, to get people and ask people, give them the opportunity to tell us what they think, right? And it is only good survey practice, particularly on surveys of this nature, to play those results back to the community from which you surveyed. So that becomes even more important because one of the themes that emerges in this survey is the fact that faculty and staff both are eager for more of a culture of communication. Some of that is communication from and with senior leadership. Some of that's communication even within departments, and some of it's communication cross-functionally. So having said that, in some regards, there's potentially some merit in talking about this as a communication tool, because it is that. I will share with you, I've not gotten any data denial from anybody at this institution or even your cabinet as we've presented the data. As Gary mentioned, we got a really strong response rate here, which anecdotally tells us people cared enough to complete the survey. From an analytical perspective, when we look at the confidence level and margins of error, we can operate with a high degree of integrity, or confidence rather, that the data set is in fact reflective of the population as a whole, whether we like what we see or not. Having said that, there's a lot to celebrate. There's a lot of good things going on here. Many of your sister campuses in the system would gladly trade out data sets, I think. That's not to say there aren't opportunities. And that's kind of how I'm going to structure this presentation. It's what I would characterize as an abbreviated SWOT analysis. It is more than a movie trailer, but less than a full-on executive summary. In the coming weeks, you'll have an opportunity to learn more about this. Now, I think one of the things important to note here, UNC Charlotte, while you all have done a lot of other surveys in the past, whether it be Coach or Harry or faculty or staff surveys out of the Senate or Council, you've not done anything quite like this before. And given that, there's not a clear roadmap or project plan for you all to follow. I would say you're making it up as you go along, but that's a little flip, and I don't think it does justice to the planning that Gary and his colleague in the cabinet are working through in terms of how we socialize this survey data, how we disseminate it, and then how we do subsequent action planning, whether that be action planning at the university-wide level or push down to the major academic or administrative unit. And in most cases, that kind of action planning happens at both levels. I do differentiate, though, between the communication phase and the action planning phase. We've deployed the survey, we've got a good data set. Now it's time to socialize the data, then we'll take action on that. One of the things Gary also mentioned at the outset, this is largely kind of essentially an unfunded mandate from the system office that was responding to essentially pressure from the General Assembly, wanting to make sure that the member institutions of the system were being good stewards, not just of the financial resources, but the human resources. Prior to deploying the survey for a period of, gosh, Gary, it had to be about 7-8 months that we did meetings with each of the chief HR officers and sometimes members from institutional research and members from the communication offices at the various institutions to figure out how we were going to roll this survey out, what kind of communication strategy was necessary prior to deploying the survey so we'd get good survey results, and how we'd manage expectations afterwards. So that group continues to meet via phone on a somewhat regular basis. As Gary mentioned, this is a 5-year project. Now, that for those of you who do survey research, particularly surveys of this nature, it's probably not a surprise to hear that when we talk about survey cycle, it would be rare for a college or university today to do a survey like this on an annual basis. While that's pretty common in the private sector, in the corporate world, the pace of change, the pace of progress at colleges and universities tends to dictate a little bit longer survey cycle. I was sharing with the cabinet, the first win, we've already had a win with the system office and the Board of Governors on this survey. When we were initially engaged to do this project, they wanted to do this survey every year for the next 5 years. Fortunately, we had a receptive audience, and we provided some counsel that probably wasn't in anybody's best interest to try and do this every year. So we moved to a 2-year survey cycle. Now, having said that, I think it's also just to note, this was not on your cabinet's radar screen. This was not something they necessarily chose to do. Having said that, I think that having spent a little bit of time with them this morning, the members of your leadership team do see the potential merit and the potential benefit of this kind of data. More than just giving us insight into the health of the culture at a particular point in time, there's a lot of potential application here. So by way of example, as I understand it, you all have a SACS reaccreditation in 2023 with a self-study due in 2019. So I would say it's not a happy accident. It's actually not a happy accident. There's some intention behind it. But many of the items on this survey, we can map pretty directly to the criteria and standards that SACS and some of the other accreditors are looking at. I would also suggest that it wouldn't be a stretch at all to tie some of these survey findings to your institutional plan. I had a chance to review your institutional plan and some of the other documentation around your mission, vision, values, and you've got some pretty ambitious goals, I would say, around your ability to attract and retain top-notch faculty and staff, or your ability to attract and retain diverse faculty and staff and students. So when you have those kinds of goals, it's important to know, what is it that's potentially compelling about us, right? If we're looking at being an employer of choice in this community or being recognized for the quality of our employment experience, it's probably a good idea to know what makes this place a special and unique place to be, place to work. All right, having said that, let's go ahead and jump into some data a little bit. So the first slide we're going to look at is just a quick overview of the survey instrument itself. And you heard Gary talk about the response rate. That's our first data point that we'll actually look at here. I want to provide some context on that. So as you're looking at the left side of the screen, you'll see the system overall response rate at 50%, and here at UNC Charlotte at 71%. We've administered surveys like this since our inception at Modern Think at all sorts of organizations. As I mentioned, most of our focus is higher ed these days. We generally see lower response rates in higher ed and healthcare when we do that kind of industry analysis. Give you a context here. Every spring we survey about 300 colleges and universities across the country in the Great Colleges to Work For program. Our average response rate ranges between 36 and 46%. Some of that's influenced by the size of the institution. Carnegie classification even has some implications or impact, as well as the institution's survey history. So a 71% response rate right out of the gate is nothing short of outstanding. And as I mentioned, it gives us some insight into, not insight, but rather confidence in the quality of the data set. One of the questions I want to get out in front of, because I regularly get asked this in the Q&A section, is about the potential impact of survey bias. Right? There may be some of you who are wondering, hey, Rich, isn't it just the happy people who are completing these surveys? Or alternatively, there may be some with more of a cynical perspective saying, hey, Rich, isn't it just the grumpy people who complete these surveys, right? While we do see that kind of survey bias in student surveys and even other kinds of surveys, I've not seen any good evidence of that kind of survey bias in engagement surveys. I've seen 3 studies over the last 5 years that have tried to dig deeper on that, none of which offered anything conclusive. So we've got a good data set. You'll see under the benchmarks here, because we've deployed essentially this survey or version thereof at lots and lots of colleges, we've got some deep benchmarking capabilities. Today, we're largely going to focus how UNC Charlotte compares across what we're seeing across the UNC system. So you'll see some data here momentarily, which will have the positive and negative results for UNC Charlotte and the positive and negative across the system, so we can see kind of where we are. We've got the ability to do all sorts of other benchmarks. For those of you who may be familiar with the Great Colleges to Work For program, the Honor Roll designation is a designation that we use for essentially the best workplaces we can find in higher ed. There's 12 recognition categories, of which any participating institution could be recognized in one or more of those categories. Those institutions that are recognized in the most number of categories achieve the special distinction that we call the Honor Roll. So it's our attempt to find, again, an aspirational benchmark. We've got others, and among the things we talked about this morning with the cabinet was the possibility of creating a custom benchmark based on your peer benchmarks or your peer institutions that you regularly compare yourselves against. The instrument itself and what we're going to focus on mostly are the 60 core belief statements. So we ask a statement, and we make a statement rather, and ask you all to respond on a 5-point agreement scale. We'll look at that scale momentarily. There were 17 benefit satisfaction items. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but you've got a lot that you can roll up your sleeves and dive into. 2 open-ended questions. We'll again revisit some of those, and I'll share with you some of the themes that emerged in those 400 pages of responses to those 2 open-ended questions. Your faculty and staff here were a lot of things, but disengaged was not one of them. 16 demographic questions, so the kinds of things that you might expect to see on a survey like this: protected class, age, gender, race, ethnicity. Gary and Jeannie and Christy and their colleagues went to great length to customize the demographics related to administrative and academic unit. So we can slice and dice the data by vice chancellor area, by college, in some cases even within departments. We need a number of respondents, at least 5, before we report out any data by any single demographic group. That's largely because one of the dynamics that surfaced in our pre-survey due diligence was that at institutions across the system, for many individuals, there was a real concern regarding how this data would be used, and in particular, whether an individual's anonymity or would be compromised, or the confidentiality of their individual responses. So we've gone to great length to protect the anonymity of those of you who have completed the survey. Bottom line, with all those demographic questions, this is a tremendously robust data set. You've got the ability to slice and dice in all sorts of different ways. Today, we're going to stay largely at that proverbial 100,000 foot level. What are the results saying for this community as a whole? There was one multi-select question which had to do reasons for leaving. We may spend a little bit of time on that afterwards. All right, so this is essentially what we did. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see response rates broken down by category. I think it is important to note we generally do see lower response rates among faculty. Our faculty response rate here was at 57%. Faculty response rates in our great colleges to work for a program typically range between 28 and 34%. So we've got a good response rate even from a segment of the population where we generally see lower response rates. For those who may not be familiar with those job categories, these are the classifications essentially that the system and the state uses in terms of categorizing different employment categories. So this is one way that we can slice and dice the data. Let's do one other quick slide on response rates, and this also previews some of what we're seeing overall. So there's a lot going on in this slide. Let me explain it here for a second. So as you're looking at it, on the left hand of the side, we've got the response rate across the institutions. And as Gary mentioned, to the extent that was a competition, you won. You all had the highest response rate at 71%, which again, I think speaks to some of the communication that was done on this campus prior to deploying the survey, so folks knew that this was in fact important and that warranted taking the time to complete. On the opposite side of this slide, what you'll see there is the overall positive response across the 60 core items. And when I say overall positive response, let's go ahead, if we can, go to the next slide. I may back up here in a second, but I want to provide the response continuum scale. So you can see the response scale here at the top of this slide. So it's a 5-point agreement scale. There is a not applicable. Most of these items are ones that even new folks can give us a meaningful answer, so we generally don't see a strong percentage of not applicable response options. I think it is important to note that midpoint reads as sometimes agree, sometimes disagree. It's not a neutral. Most folks don't tend to feel neutral about the kind of things we're asking about here. And for our purposes today, we're going to do a version of top box analysis, where we're going to combine the strongly agree and agree response options. We'll characterize that as a positive response. That's what we want. That's what we're looking for. And we'll do the same on the negative end of the continuum. This chart is intended as a rule of thumb, right? Some of these items that we'll look at, notably the items related to compensation, staffing, resources, they're much more difficult to do well on than others. But as a general rule of thumb, this chart can help us make quick meaning of what is a very robust data set. When you see a positive response at the 75% level or above, we would characterize that as exceptional. So that's kind of where another way of potentially describing that is the realm of great workplaces. Most of our benchmarks in terms of our honor roll institutions are going to be at that level or above, with a handful of exceptions, mostly some of those items, the resource constraints and the compensation items I just mentioned. 65 to 74 is notable because your overall positive response is 65%. I'd probably be a little more generous in my characterization in this chart and think good to very good. You know, when you're at that range, for the vast majority of your folks, you're likely a very good place to work. You may not necessarily be an excellent place or the best we can find in higher ed, but you're no doubt a very good place to work. When you have aspirational goals, as you all do in your institutional plan, regarding retention, regarding a culture of recognition, regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, then anything below 55% is frankly not going to be congruent with executing on those goals. On the opposite side of the response continuum, I think it is also important to note we expect to see negative response on every one of these items. So negative response in and of itself doesn't alarm me. I start to get curious at 15%. And at 20%, you absolutely have my attention, right? So when 1 in 5 of our community is experiencing some organizational dynamic or some leadership or managerial competency, the exact opposite of how we would want them to. You know, at that level, we certainly need to be paying attention. All right, let's go back to the previous slide if we can, just so again we can see a little bit context how we measure up against the system. So on the right side of this slide, you'll see the overall positive response across the 60 core items. You can see at 65% for University of North Carolina, Charlotte. That was on the higher end of the continuum across the states. All right, we've talked about response guidelines. Let's talk for a second about the core dimensions on the survey. So those of you who do survey research know that if you're going to do a survey, you've got to check for content validity on your items. You want it to be more than just a collection of interesting statements. This is an instrument we spent a lot of time developing. We do a lot of testing on it every year. Every 3 years, we assemble a blue ribbon panel of experts across higher ed to weigh in on it. We call these dimensions or themes. The reality is we get to these through a series of what initially started as exploratory factor analysis and now is confirmatory factor analysis. Most of these themes we can tie directly to the academic research on employee engagement or workplace culture. Both of those have their roots in the construct of organizational citizenship, but there's a reason that we ask everything that we do here. So these are the core dimensions. I'll give you just when we're reporting them out, we report the items out on the dimension on which they load the strongest or which they're more intuitive. There's some items that load on multiple dimensions. For example, there's an item, senior leadership communicates openly about important matters, that loads on both the communication dimension and the senior leadership dimension. We report it out on the senior leadership dimension. That's a little more detail than you may want, but that's giving you some insight just in terms of the history of the instrument itself. What we're going to look at now is the overall percent positive across these various dimensions, and we're going to look at the Charlotte results, and we're going to compare them to what we see across the system as a whole. And we're going to go in declining order. So, and this kind of essentially foreshadows some of my SWOT analysis. But you do very well on the job satisfaction items when we ask about job fit, when we ask about autonomy, we ask about sense of pride as well, sense of connection to the organization and understanding of how what you do impacts the mission. Those were among the highest scoring items on the survey. The supervisor department chair dimension is an important one. Most of the research on employee engagement will point to that as, if not the single most important driver of an engaged employee, certainly one of the top drivers. And we got a good foundation here. Because I'm a data guy, let me do a quick poll. I'm curious. How many folks, just by a show of hands, have had the following experience? You've had a supervisor or manager at some point in your professional career whom you liked. You had a really good relationship with them. You just didn't think they were a very good manager. How many folks have had that experience? Okay, so in this case, it's over 80%, I think I can say confidently. The good news, there's a lot of good news here in that you all do report good relationship with your managers and your supervisors, both on the academic as well as the administrative side of the house. And when we look individually at some of those items specifically related to key managerial competencies, you also do well on those. So we got a good foundation on which to build. I may sound like I'm giving you mixed messages, but on the opportunity side of the ledger, we're going to talk about strengths and we're going to talk about opportunities. And on the opportunity side of the ledger, there's a theme around performance management and accountability. And one of the things that I think is influencing that is a competency that we often look to for those who are in managerial or supervisory roles, and that has to do with what I'm going to call our fluency and our comfort with the difficult conversations. And those difficult conversations can manifest in a lot of different ways. Telling somebody they're not getting the resources that they need, telling somebody they're not getting the promotion that they think they deserve, telling somebody that their behavior is not congruent with the values, telling somebody that their performance isn't up to standard. When I look at this data set, I want to absolutely applaud and celebrate the good work that's happening at the supervisor department chair level for the most part. And I would wonder if there's not an opportunity to enhance or strengthen the competencies of those who are in leadership roles at multiple levels within the university on some of these dynamics that we're talking about that influence a culture of accountability. I'm getting a little far ahead of myself, but we'll back up for now. We'll come back to that later, rather. Professional development, the belief that you've got opportunities to learn and grow, the understanding of what you need to do in advance in the organization, those are important drivers of engagement. You do pretty well on those, particularly the first of those two items. On the next slide, you will see the second of our three in this progression. There's a growing body of research that is essentially finding a pretty significant connection to our experience of senior leadership. Right? What we think about senior leadership in terms of their capabilities. Do we think they have the knowledge, the skills, the experience to lead? Their credibility, do their actions match their words? Do they kind of walk the talk? Their communication, Are they transparent? Are they candid? Do they create opportunities for give and take? Or is it just an experience of being talked at as opposed to being talked with? So all of those things can impact the experience of senior leadership. We've actually got some pretty good news here. You do well on that dimension, and it's system-wide. Your regard for senior leadership, which was defined as the chancellor and his or her direct reports, were among some of the highest there. Compensation, benefits, and work-life balance, there's a lot going on in that dimension. You do very well on the work-life balance items, pretty good on the benefits item. Compensation, I'm sure not a surprise to anybody in this room, a real pain point, not isolated to any one group, both faculty and staff. Nobody's got a monopoly on feeling like they're the only ones who are undercompensated. And that is a system-wide issue, no question about that. I think one of the benefits, and I would say it's not even an unintended consequence, it's very much an intended consequence. Having deployed the survey across the system, your colleagues in the system office have a good data set with which, and probably better than they've had before, to help advance the conversation regarding some of the pain points around this theme of resource constraints, which compensation is part of that theme. So more than anecdotes now, across the system, you've got some data to hopefully advance that conversation. Respect and appreciation is an important dimension, particularly when there's a dynamic where people don't feel like they have the resources they need. So some of that's a function of your awards and recognition processes, years of service programs, for example. Some of that's also a function of the recognition that plays out at the work group or department level, ideally between an employee and their immediate supervisor. And we've got some opportunities in that dimension. If we look at the third of our progression on these three slides, you'll see a number of items here that are frankly pretty closely connected. And for me, when I think of communication and collaboration and shared governance, I think of almost a hierarchy. I would suggest that the quality of your communication informs the quality of your collaboration, and a very specific form of collaboration on most college campuses is this construct of shared governance. So I'm not surprised when I see the collaboration and shared governance results being what they are when I see the communication dimension. The faculty administration staff relations is very similar to the shared governance. The fairness dimension, that alludes to some of what I've talked about already in terms of the performance management and accountability. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next slide. And what we're looking at here is what we call a top-line report. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because this is a really dense slide, and I recognize from those in the back maybe it's tough to see, but what we've got going on here is the overall positive percent, the percent positive across the dimensions broken down by job classification with a little color coordination. You can see some of the issues are a little bit more acute among the faculty. When we look at issues regarding resource constraints and adequacy of facilities, our faculty are lower than our staff on those items. Again, that's not atypical across the system. Let's go ahead and advance. This is another system. So you heard Gary mention that the Board of Governors had a presentation last week. This slide, as well as the slide that we looked at earlier, which had the response rate and the overall positive response, these two slides rather are from that deck. The system isn't invested in doing a whole lot of comparisons across individual institutions. I want to provide data, so we can have some sort of context and help individual institutions. But I don't think there's a lot of interest in creating artificial competition across the member institutions. What's nice about this slide, this is essentially, we're looking at two different items here, the overall satisfaction, but we're also looking at it in combination with voluntary turnover. So that upper right-hand quadrant is essentially where you want to be. High engagement, low turnover. And you can see you are up there along with Western Carolina and the School of the Arts. So in system-wide, those are actually pretty good results. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. What we're looking at here is the overall positive response across the job classifications that we just talked about earlier. One of the things that I can share with you around some of what we're learning from this Great Colleges to Work For research is I essentially could do a list of bullet points of what I sometimes call differentiating qualities of great workplaces. What are the things that we're seeing at these great workplaces that we're not seeing elsewhere? One of the things that seems to be happening pretty consistently is when we look at the results at these institutions across job classification or across major academic or major administrative unit, we don't see a lot of variation. The range between the high and the low is pretty small. So it leads me to kind of translate that to there's a consistency of experience They're not just great workplaces for tenured faculty or for the cabinet. There's a consistency of experience. So, when we see a consistency of experience, that's generally a good thing. You can see here for our Tier 1 and Tier 2 TAF, notably more positive on that. I'll talk a little bit more about that Tier 1, Tier 2 connection here shortly, but I will highlight the fact that those two are pretty close. One of the things, a dynamic that we're seeing at a lot of institutions in the system is a big gap between the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 respondents, which typically is going to be the cabinet and then they're as Tier 1, and then the direct reports, and sometimes another level down in Tier 2. That's a rule of thumb, not necessarily a bright line distinction. But this speaks to the alignment of your senior-most levels of leadership, which we see manifest in other parts of the survey as well. All right, let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So here, again, very simple. This is my homage to David Letterman. We're going to keep it simple. We'll do a top 10. And in the spirit of being appropriately transparent and being candid, we're going to look at the bottom 10 here shortly as well. But we'll look at the top 10 to start us off. So in terms of top 10 results, and again, most of these top 10 items we're going to see in our thematic analysis on the strength side of the ledger. I mentioned already a sense of connection to mission, a sense of pride. Certainly you get a sense of that in items 5 and item 49. So at the risk of stating the obvious, let me just share with you what you're looking at here. The number on the left side of the slide is the number of the item in the sequence of the survey, followed by the item itself, and then the positive and negative, respectively, of UNC Charlotte, and then the system aggregate. Item 2 is a nice finding. It has to do with autonomy. One of the good things about that item in the UNC Charlotte data set is that it's not just strong for faculty. We generally see stronger results on item number 2 for faculty, stronger for faculty than we do among staff. And the fact that we see very strong response on that item for staff as well suggests that this dynamic of autonomy, the antithesis of being micromanaged, is manifesting at multiple areas here. 29 is maybe not a glamorous item, but it's an important one, particularly for an urban research university. At 82 and 5, that's an excellent finding. I recognize we're not in the heart of Charlotte, but nonetheless, it's an important finding in terms of folks feeling like there's adequate focus and attention paid to creating a safe environment. Let's go ahead and look at the bottom half of our top 10 statements. And for you keen observers here, you'll note that there are 3 items in our top 10, 3 on this slide alone, that speak to supervisor department chair. Item number 24, good relationship. Item 47, the support one gets for work-life balance. And item 15, which is essentially a credibility statement. Do we model the institution's values? So we've got some good news on those. Item 1 is job fit. We're going to, again, look at that collectively here with some thematically related items. And item 25 is an interesting one. That's what we would call a barometer statement. There's nothing actionable in it, but it gives us insight into a dynamic that we know is really important, and that is that collective experience at the work group. I would date myself, but I think there are lots of folks who will get this next comparison. But Tip O'Neill was famous for a quote that all politics are local. And my variation on that is all great workplaces start at the local level. If you're unhappy, if you're not content, if you don't have a high level of connection and or engagement in your work group or your team or your department, it's not likely you're going to experience the organization as a great place to work. Over the last 10 years, I've seen some results from institutions that have big, iconic brands. They're national or, dare I say, international reputations. So you would think anybody who associated with them would be proud to work there. And I've seen some folks who are pretty miserable despite those national reputations because their work group experience is not very solid. So this is a good finding that when we ask about the work group experience, the department experience, we've got some very positive results. The next slide essentially is our headlines on this SWOT analysis. So most of this at this point should start to be familiar. I think I've foreshadowed, if not spoken directly, to pretty much all of these, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions. And what we're going to do here momentarily is we're going to look at essentially the supporting evidence that leads us to characterize these as a strength today. We've not talked about the diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's going to be an important one. We'll look at that because there's a lot of language in your institutional plan and in your mission and vision and objectives and administrative values that are very much related to welcoming environment and the institution's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right, so let's look at the first of those 5, job fit, autonomy, connection to mission. We've seen a handful of these statements individually, and when you look at them collectively, given how they are thematically related, it clearly jumps off the page that we got some good things going on here. Again, related to job fit, autonomy, impact in the community, which is even more important these days among some of our younger generations. They want to believe and know that their employer is a responsible member of the community, a good steward of the local resources. So we have a nice finding on item 49. Item 36 really is more of an outcome of engagement as opposed to a driver engagement, but this is a theme that shows up in the verbatim responses as well. The 2 open-ended questions I alluded to earlier. One is from an appreciative inquiry lens. What do you appreciate most about working at this institution? And the second, more of a solution-oriented lens. What would make this a better place to work? In response to that first question, we see a number of individuals commenting about that sense of connection to each other, so the relationships, that's very much a theme in there, the sense of connection to community, the impact in the community, the impact on the students, and an overarching sense of pride. So these aren't isolated findings, and they're very much echoed in the verbatims. If we look at the next slide, we'll talk about work-life balance, and again, there's more than a passing reference in your institutional plan to the commitment to work-life balance and wellness as being part of what makes this a compelling workplace. Item 47 we saw earlier in terms of the support one gets from one's immediate supervisor. Item 53, a little bit lower, we're asking here about essentially the institutional policies and practices. There's sometimes, when I have more time, I'll sometimes do an exercise. I've done this with clients, I've done it at conferences, where I'll ask people to partner up with a colleague or two and to think about some sort of organizational dynamic or some sort of managerial or leadership competency and think about what it would look like at a good workplace and then compare and contrast that, what that same dynamic would look like at a great workplace. And inevitably, when I do that exercise, I hear things like, well, at a good workplace, we'd have generous time off or PTO or vacation. At a great workplace, you could actually use that, right? And I think there's a similar dynamic in terms of work-life balance, and that's why we asked these 2 different items here. One about the institutional commitment and policies, the other around really essentially where the rubber hits the road. Does your supervisor actually support it? And again, we've got some good findings on those. Our next slide talks a little bit about professional development. And again, most of the engagement research, this is considered a significant driver. Item 6 simply gives us insight into the belief that there's opportunities to advance your skills, right? There's opportunities to develop. At 75 and 8, you all were the highest scoring institution in the system on that one item there. Item 7, we're asking about, obviously, the supervisor dynamic here, providing feedback. And item 10, do you understand the steps necessary to advance? I think item 10, some of the institutions that I've seen do well on that item, one of the things that they seem to do is they're really good about managing expectations. They're clear about succession planning, about managerial leadership competencies, what kind of skills you need to master to be effective at different levels. So they're managing expectations from the outset as opposed to just not providing any context regarding people's expectations of what it means or what it looks like to advance in the institution. All right, let's go to supervisor department chair competencies. So we saw a good relationship. And we've got, as I mentioned, more good news here. And then when we kind of peel away the layers of the proverbial onion, there's some things that are happening well. I think item number 3, arguably this is one of the most important things a good manager, a good supervisor does, make expectations clear. So we've got a very solid finding on that. 7, about providing feedback. We're going to circle back to that when we talk about performance management and accountability. 12 is a credibility statement, as is 15. 19 is related to credibility, but also related to the perception of a level playing field. I think oftentimes what happens is, particularly when there are issues regarding performance management and accountability, some of the tough conversations as managers, if we're not comfortable with those, we tend to avoid them, or we look for HR to fix our problems. And that's not to say there's not a role for HR to help, there is, but there's absolutely a role for those in supervisory and managerial and leadership roles to ensure that faculty and staff have an experience of fair treatment, of a level playing field. And that's essentially what we're asking at 19. We've got some pretty good news on that. In terms of our senior leadership, so this is a different level of leadership. So on the next slide, what we're looking at here And again, some of them are positive findings in the system, not necessarily at the elite levels, but pretty good. Item number 32 is arguably one of the most important items in this dimension. Do you believe that your leadership has what it takes to be effective in their roles? It's 72% positive. It's a resounding yes. 27 and 41 are obviously two of the lower scoring items in this dimension, in much the same fashion that I think a key job of a supervisor is to make expectations clear. Similarly, I think one of the most important things senior leadership does is provide clear direction, where we go and how we're going to get there. That's not a bad finding at 60% positive at 14. Given the recency of your institutional plan, 2016, and what appeared to be a pretty collaborative process in terms of developing that, I thought this might be a little bit higher. I'm not alarmed by that, but I wonder if there aren't opportunities for you all to better connect folks on a more regular basis around the work that we're doing and how it's advancing some of the goals, initiatives, and objectives you laid out in your strategic plan. Because it's not as resonant for folks as ultimately it could be. When we expand that frame of reference in item 41, not just communicating about clear direction, but communication in general at 57 and 12, I mentioned at the outset there's a theme here around communication, folks wanting more communication. Some of that is communication from and with senior leadership, but that doesn't necessarily translate to another email or another newsletter. And some of that's a function of just the quality of our dialogue, both within our teams, departments, work groups, as well as across departments. 56 is a credibility statement. 37 is not so much credibility, but there's a difference. And I can see it pretty clearly in the survey results. When faculty and staff believe that senior leadership actually cares about them, as opposed to thinking that faculty and staff are just essentially cogs in the machine that is this university. At 60 and 14, we got a pretty good finding, and certainly better than what we see across the system. All right, let's look at our next slide, which has to do with 3 diversity, equity, inclusion statements. The first item, giving us some insight into institutional commitment. This institution places sufficient emphasis on having diverse faculty, administration, and staff. I'll contrast that with item 45, which gives us insight into welcoming environment. And item 54 is really kind of a risk management question, although we're asking here about processes or procedures rather. Do people understand what resources are available to them if they don't feel like they've been treated fairly? So we're coming at it from different angles. The good news is that when we look at these items, certainly overall, we've got pretty good findings. At 74, 75, and 70 respectively, we've got low negatives. So we can celebrate that. Those are among the higher scoring statements on the survey. That's good news. And we can't be lulled into a false sense of security. These items are particularly important ones to look at by protected class. And when you look at gender, age, race, ethnicity, particularly just through the race ethnicity lens, when you look at how those who identify as Black or African American responded on these items, particularly on items 50 and 45, they're not nearly this positive. All right? They're in the 55, 58% range. So we can do both of those things. We can acknowledge that there's some good work going on, and we also have to hold ourselves accountable that our work is not yet done. Okay, now we're going to look at a few other barometer statements. So we saw item 25, all things are my department is a good place to work. When we expand the frame of reference on item 60, all things considered, this is a great place to work. We've got a pretty good finding there as well at 75 and 40. If I were just to look at that one item, I'd say, yeah, y'all are a very good, if not great place to work. The reality, though, is when we tease that out, when we ask about all the individual things that ultimately lead to whether you're a great place to work or not, today, the sum of the parts doesn't add up to that, right? So I'm thrilled that you have such a high positive response on item 60 today, and unless you all address some of the pain points, it's not likely that that would be sustainable over time. Item 59 is an interesting one. This institution's culture is special, unique, something special, something you don't find just anywhere. And at 50 and 19, that's the lowest scoring item for you all, or among the lowest scoring items, better said. And it is one of the few items where you're also, as you'll note, below the system aggregate. At our best places to work, whether it be in higher ed or any of the other industries where we've done similar work, that item at our best places is highly predictive of item 60. So this is another one of those things that I would suggest is a differentiating quality of great workplaces. The perception among faculty and staff that we're a special and unique workplace, that working here is different and or better than what my other options might be, whether it be in this Charlotte community or whether I'm looking in the higher ed world in which I'm potentially looking for employment. well, I think this is a real opportunity for you all. I think you have a tremendous narrative. There's no question to me as I look at your data, as I look at who you all are as an institution, look at your history, you've got all the parts of a very compelling narrative. I just think today you've not necessarily brought those parts together and told that story in a way where faculty and staff really do feel like this is a special place to be, given my other options. Okay, let's look at our next slide. And this is also one where we're breaking down by job classification. And you can see among our Tier 1 staff, and to a lesser extent, but still strong, our Tier 2 staff, there is a greater sense that the culture is special, unique, but that is not consistent across our job classifications, certainly not for faculty or EHRA folks. All right, I wish I had a camera to take a picture of the audience on this next slide. Let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. And we are going to look at the first of 2 slides with our bottom 10 statements. And inevitably, when I do this, there's open mouths, right? He's not really showing that data, is he? Or are they really going there? And as I mentioned, not only have I've not run into any real data denial from any of your leaders. I think there's a willingness to be appropriately transparent with the data and to use it to help as best possible. So let's look at the bottom 10 statements. So there's a theme, as I mentioned earlier, around resource constraints. There's a theme around performance management. You certainly see that in the compensation, item 11 and item 28. I would both characterize that as resource constraints. 35 are in recognition. We'll talk about recognition and respect momentarily. 16 is, again, a performance management, although here we're asking specifically about promotions. And 22 is a communication item. You'll note our positives are much lower than anything we've seen. Our negatives, similarly, are much higher. You'll also note that you're in good company with your colleagues across the system. This resource constraints theme, this accountability theme, pretty consistent across most of the 17 institutions. Let's go ahead and look at the next half of our bottom 10. So item 18, I alluded to difficult conversations. Item 18 gives us some insight to that. We here again see item number 59. 9 is yet another recognition statement. So we've got 2 recognition statements here on our bottom 10. 17 is a performance management statement. 42, both a communication and collaboration item as it relates to people feel like they're appropriately involved in institutional planning. So those are the lowest scoring 10 items. As I was sharing this with the captain, I said, we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off, right? We're going to look at them right now. Let's go right to the core and look at the low scoring items. Let's do essentially the same thematic analysis that we did on the strength side. Let's look at the opportunities. And again, at this point, given our conversation and some of what I shared with you, I don't think you'll see anything here that we've not alluded to. We're just going to look at it through a little bit different lens. So here are the headlines. Let's go ahead and tease out the resource constraints. You can see it manifests in a couple different ways. Certainly compensation. Staffing is yet another one. And when we ask a more general overarching question around provided the resources I need to be effective, a little bit better, but still not necessarily where we would ultimately want it to be. The compensation issues and the staffing issues are particularly acute among faculty, and even our Tier 1 staff were low on those items. Let's look at the facilities item, which is the next slide. And here again, you get a sense of that. So we're asking about the facilities in addition to compensation, in addition to staffing levels. Do they adequately meet my needs? And while we do see better results among some of our staff groups, I would characterize that at the acute level among our Tier 1 and our faculty. Now, part of the complicating factor when there's issues regarding resource constraints, not only does it impact one's ability to get the job done, but for many, it's also viewed through a fairness or respect lens, right? It's not fair for you to expect us to get the work of 8 done, because we used to have 8, and now we only have 5, right? That's not fair. Or you don't appreciate how hard we're working given the lack of resources, or the fact that you're working with old computers, or that the facilities don't meet our needs. So again, there's kind of multiple potential impacts here, none of which are good in terms of the ability to get our job done and or the sense of feeling treated fairly and or respectfully. So again, I think you've got, your colleagues, the folks in the system have some good data to help advance the conversation with the board and the General Assembly around some of the pain points that folks are feeling as a function of the decisions that have been made in terms of where funds are allocated. All right, so let's look at the next of our slides, and this has to do with performance management and accountability. And I'm going to come at it from a couple different angles here, because I think performance management is more than just your annual review process. And the reality is today, there's a lot of frustration across the system with the review process. Nobody's suggesting that the review process itself, it's item 17, is as effective as it needs to be. But again, I think performance management is much more than just annual review process. I would suggest that what we're doing in terms of our orientation and onboarding processes with faculty and staff, that's in some regards the first step of performance management. Are we setting people up to be successful in how we integrate them into the university, into our community? At 62 and 11, it's not the lowest scoring item, but it's one that I absolutely think is worth looking at. This is one where it may seem like simply an HR responsibility. There's no doubt there's a role for HR, and if you're relying on HR alone to do your onboarding orientation, you're probably going to be sorely disappointed, right? The best onboarding programs I've seen generally do three things. There's an integration into the culture, the history of the university. This is who we are. This is our leadership. These are our values. This is how we engage with the community. So there's a connection to, again, the history, the culture, the values. There is, and I tease a little bit with the HR, there's certainly a role for the important onboarding that happens with HR, benefits enrollment, compensation, kind of introduction to policies, practices, professional development, et cetera. Often overlooked is the onboarding that theoretically should happen at the division or department level, right? So if you are a department chair or a dean or a vice chancellor and you're expecting HR to do all of your orientation, unless you're doing the orientation or onboarding that really is more localized, then we're probably not setting people up to be as effective as they can, as quickly as they can. It's interesting to me. This is an area that I see a lot of colleges and universities struggle with or overlook. And there's a little bit of irony on that because at most of these same colleges or universities, we're really good with our orientation processes for our first year and our transfer students. That's not an accident. We know as a function of some of the research in student affairs, the sooner we get students connected to each other, to faculty, to the resources, to the community, the more likely they're going to be successful. And I think there's a corollary for that as it relates to setting our new faculty and new staff up to be effective. That also this is an example, I don't think anybody in your HR office was surprised by this. And arguably even outside of your HR office. It's a known issue, and as I understand it, there's even been some work done over the last year to strengthen the onboarding processes. We talked about 17, 16, 18, and 19. There's potentially a role for HR to help out with those, and I would also suggest for those of you all in this room today who are in a role where you're supervising others, these are essentially managerial competencies that we need to be good at. The ability, I spoke to this earlier, the ability to have difficult conversations. And some of those conversations we have evidenced here, right? The ability to tell somebody their performance isn't up to standard, or the ability to tell somebody in a constructive and productive way that, hey, they're not getting the promotion that they are so excited about. If we're not good at those conversations, typically one of two things happen. We either avoid them altogether, or alternatively, we kind of muddle through them, in some cases make a bigger mess of the situation than we did beforehand. So I would wonder, again, if there's not an opportunity to shore up some of the institutional competency as it relates to difficult conversations. One of the other areas, and very much related to what we were just talking about, and related to work-life balance and related to difficult conversations, if we're just relying on years of service awards and distinguished teaching awards to create a culture of recognition, we're probably going to be sorely disappointed, right? Not that there's not a role for those, there is, particularly when they're done in a way where they're really meaningful to folks, and it's not just a kind of checklist exercise. But I would wonder, are those things that you're currently doing, those kind of formal things, are they meaningful? Are they having the kind of impact that we want them to have? And if not, how can we tweak them? And I would also wonder, how is it, and I'm going to come back to this supervisory managerial competency, do those who are in leadership roles understand the role that they play in creating a culture of respect and a culture of appreciation, right? Are we as good as managers or department chairs or deans or directors or whatever the title might be? Am I as diligent about catching people doing things right and acknowledging that and celebrating that as I am about catching people when they come up short? And I think from what I see here in this data set, there's probably opportunities to do more of both. All right, let's look at this. We'll break down item 17 by job classification. And again, a little bit better among our tier 1, tier 2. And when we look at our staff side of the house, clearly some opportunities there in terms of the review process. Again, I don't think that was news to anybody here. So we're going to look at the next 3 slides, which is this progression of communication, collaboration, and shared governance. And on the communication and collaboration slides, the first 2 items, in this case item 8 and 21, the frame of reference is more localized, right? You can see at item 21, in my department, we communicate openly about issues that impact each other's work. The bottom 2 statements in this slide, ones are more related kind of institutional communication, right? At this institution, we discuss and debate issues respectfully to get better results. At 52 and 14, it's, I think that's a real opportunity there for you all in terms of how is it we create more a culture of dialogue. And some of these, particularly item 21, this has nothing to do with senior leadership. Item 8 ideally plays out at multiple levels, but certainly plays out at the work group or department level. And I would suggest that if we want a culture of innovation, a culture of creativity, a culture of continuous improvement, and as I looked at some of your institutional plan and some of the strategic initiatives that you had, I saw more than a couple references to continuous improvement processes, whether it was about the university issues or other ways just to streamline bureaucracy. If we want to be more efficient, if we want to be more innovative, then we want to do well on items 8 and 43. We want people being able to advance their best thinking, not necessarily believing that every idea we have is going to be implemented, but is at least going to get a fair shake? Is it going to get heard? And, are we able to have vigorous dialogue? Can we debate ideas and approaches and do it respectfully and vigorously, but without necessarily getting stuck in our particular strength of our own convictions or the rightness of our own convictions? Let's look at the next slide here. So when we ask this item around quality of dialogue, we see some good things happening at the tier 1 level, not necessarily at the tier 2. I'm curious, just by a show of hands, there was on the website, when I look at mission, vision, and values, there's a document that talks about administrative principles and values. Is anybody familiar, just by a show of hands, if you're familiar with the administrative principles and values? Let me see. Okay. Check it out. It's on the website. It's on your website. It's related to mission, vision, values. As I understand it, these were originally designed to provide kind of a framework for your cabinet in terms of how they would work together, right? So the principles and values. My sense that some of these principles and values are actually having an impact on how they work together. So by way of example, this is item 43. At this institution, we discuss and debate issues respectfully to get better results. So one of their values here, articulated in this administrative principles and values, decisions must be in the best long-term interest of the university as a whole. Turf-based concerns need look elsewhere for support, right? And there are some others, and I think one of the things I like about these values is they seem real. And in talking with your cabinet today, they've spent some time developing these. They revisit them on a regular basis. And it appears to me that these are actually influencing how they're working together. So it's a nice finding that at least our tier 1 are having a better experience on this. All right, if we look at the next set of slides on our collaboration dimensions, 13 and 23, again, more specific to the local level. People in my department work well. We have opportunities to contribute. When you ask about expand the frame in items 26, or item 58, obviously much lower items. Item 58 at our honor roll institutions, at our best places to work, generally correlates pretty closely with item 59, the item related to a special and unique culture. Right? When there is a commonly held perception of a special and unique culture, that tends to bring a community together. I know y'all have been doing some work over the last couple of years, and even before that, on branding, right? Who we are to our students, who we are in this community. I think that's important work, and I think that work could be the foundation on some work that you potentially could do around your employment brand, right? Who we are as an employer. As again, when there's that sense of a common experience of who we are, what our common values are, what it means to be a member of this community, that tends to bring a community together in a different way and in a stronger way than what we're seeing today on item 58. Item 58 is another one. When we look at that across job classification here on this next slide, you can see, very different among our tier 1, better among our tier 2, but certainly not as consistent as we would ultimately want across our various job classifications. All right, let's talk about a very specific form of collaboration, which is shared governance. Shared governance and communication, there are two things that I think are easy to talk about in the abstract, right? Who's not for good communication, who's not for shared governance. There's no one right way to do shared governance. I have literally seen hundreds of shared governance models. So one of the things that I would wonder about is, do faculty and staff at this university understand all the various components and all various pieces of your shared governance model? Your shared governance model, I would suggest, is more than just a faculty senate or a faculty council or a staff council. This system in particular here in North Carolina is a highly complex system, right? There are a number of things and even items that surface in this survey that are beyond the control of your chancellor or his cabinet collectively. Right, so this university is part of a system that is influenced by a system office, that is influenced by a board of governors, that is influenced by a very active, if not political, General Assembly. It's a highly complex situation. So if we don't understand where the decision-making authority is, what the decision-making authority groups are, and what the process is by which those decisions are made, then there's all sorts of room for misinterpretation, right? I know nobody feels like they're compensated well across this system, or as well as they'd like to be, or that staffing issues aren't where we want them to be. And a lot of that is not in the immediate or direct sphere of control or sphere of influence of your chancellors and, again, even your leadership teams. So even though it's not the lowest scoring item on item 38, I think there's an opportunity there. Our faculty were even lower on that item. So if we don't understand the role of faculty in your shared governance model, again, not likely we're going to have an accurate lens by which to view decisions and assess whether things have been appropriately inclusive or not. We do see a better finding on item 39 when we're asking specifically about the education program processes. 42, 46, and 55, again, we see kind of similar findings in some regards related to being actively involved, feeling like that we're in it together, and the quality of our communication. All right, here's what I think I'd like to do at this point. I mentioned that we were going to have times for questions and answers. And before I jump right into questions and answers, let me invite a conversation. Actually, let me do two things here first. Indulge me for a second. I'm looking at my clock now, and we're at 2:02. And on a 2:02, after lunch, a time slot like this, there's a term that I was recently introduced to called food coma. Anybody familiar with that term? Where a little bit after lunch, everything runs to our stomach, we start to get tired. In the hopes of fighting off some food coma, but also doing an exercise that there's a point to, let me ask you to indulge me in a quick exercise. And what I'll simply ask you to do is go ahead and take your index finger and point it right over your finger, just over your head, just like this. Excellent. And now we're going to multitask, because most of us have to multitask in our work. And what I'll ask you to do is go ahead and draw some circles on the ceiling in a clockwise fashion. That's the important part, clockwise. And if you need a good stretch, go ahead and get your whole arm into it. But do clockwise circles on the ceiling. Okay, excellent. Now we're going to step up the multitasking, and what I'll simply ask you to do now is, while making that same clockwise motion, go ahead and lower your arm, making that same clockwise motion until it's now in your lap. Somebody tell me which way it's going. All right, there's a lot of confused looking people out here. Let's try that one more time. We'll do a remedial in the session afterwards. Let's go ahead and point it straight up. Big circles. Don't throw your arm out of socket. Big circles. Lowering, lowering, lowering. And now, if I'm not mistaken, it's going the opposite way. Right? So it's, yeah, woo-hoo. It's like David Copperfield. So this is a great exercise to do at a bar when there's been alcohol involved. And somebody tell me what's going on, that it seems we're doing the same motion, but it looks like it's going the opposite way. What's happening here? You're looking at it from the other side, exactly. Your perception is different. In this case, we're looking at that same motion from below, right? And now as we lower this down, bring it into our lap, we're looking at that same motion from above. So the movement hasn't changed. The only thing that changed is our perspective, right? So why would I do an exercise like this at this point in the presentation? And it's not just to make sure you all were awake. But with a data set like this, sometimes what happens is when this kind of data comes back, it can be an opportunity to look at the organization from a different perspective, right? Because there's generally a way that we're accustomed to seeing things, interpreting things. So I'll encourage you, as you have opportunities in the coming weeks and months to look at this, to be curious about this survey data. What can we learn from it? How can it help us be more of who we want, and how is it we work together as a community on that? So it's an opportunity to look at things a little bit differently. All right, so before I go to questions, let me ask you to do this. Indulge me in a 2-minute conversation. What I'll simply ask you to do is coalesce with a group of 2 or 3, no more than 2 or 3. Go ahead and do that now real quick, so everybody's got a colleague to chat with. If you need to move a little bit, go ahead and do that. Everybody needs a quick partner to talk with. And the first thing I'll ask you to do is introduce yourself if you've not done that yet. Go ahead and introduce yourself. And I said 2 minutes, but I'm going to make it 30 seconds. Here's what I want to invite: a quick conversation. I'm curious with your new colleague, your new friend, just a quick comment around your reaction to what you've seen up here. Any of this surprise you? Does it reflect your day-to-day experience? Do you think, oh my gosh, Rich, that's way off. Are you sure that's not NC State's data set? But I'm curious for your reactions and thoughts before we segue into questions. Enjoy your conversations. I'll call you back in 30 seconds. Fifteen-second warning, folks. We'll come back together in 15 seconds. All right, coming back together as a large group. Welcome back, folks. All right, welcome back. So you guys are modeling some of that strong community and some of that appreciation of relationship that I alluded to earlier. I welcome questions at this point. If there's something I can address, I'll absolutely do it. If not, I'll either defer to somebody who can, or we'll get back to you. I see a question in the back.
I'm a department chair, and there aren't many of us in the room. Oh, hi. I'm a department chair, and I really don't, are there any other chairs here? Am I the only one? My question is this. You looked at this from the 100,000 foot level.
Yeah.
Will department chairs get access to information about their own departments?
Yeah. So potentially, yes. It depends on the number of respondents. As I mentioned earlier, we've got to protect the anonymity of individual respondents. So we generally work with an N of 5. I know after the cabinet meeting this morning, the vice chancellors were essentially provided a report suite of the results of their particular areas. So some of those departments may meet that threshold, some may not. I think it can be a terrifically powerful tool for a department chair. I think the intention is that we use this to be better. So I think if you make the request, absolutely. To the extent I feel like I'm hedging, I don't want to make any commitments that I'm not in a position to make, but I think that's the intention. And from everything I've seen and heard this morning and working with Gary and Jeannie and their colleagues, I think that it is more likely than not that you'll be able to have access to that. Gary, anything you'd add to that, Gary?
What we did in addition to participating, we bought what's called a gateway tool, which allows us to do a lot of analysis and dissecting of analysis. To Rich's point, the provost, as an example for academic affairs, was provided with all the data for her administrative units in her colleges and the departments within the colleges, I believe. And so there is a lot of capacity for Steve Coppola, Lori McMahon to work with us to gain access to that, to be able to help Joan make sense of that data for academic affairs at large, but the same for all the other vice chancellors. That's the reason we invested in buying that tool.
Yeah, great, good question. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Sure, I'll make it.
Yes, sir. We got,
Yeah. For a comment, then a question.
Sure.
The comment is that was an awful lot of Carolina blue on the slides, and my eyes were starting to hurt by the end. Maybe
So-
the next time, a nice rich green.
so noted, so
would be-
noted.
Yeah. The question is, you talked about what came out of the appreciation on the open-ended. Could you talk about any themes that you saw emerging from the solutions side of the open-ended
Yeah.
questions?
Yeah, good question. And let me spend a second, even before I deal with some of the thematic analysis from that, but just about verbatims in general. So I don't know how you all have treated verbatims with your other surveys, but despite our best coaching in the instructions, where we encourage people not to share any information that may be self-identifying, people inevitably provide us information in those comments that is in fact self-identifying. And, well, I wouldn't say it's huge. There are, there's some of your colleagues who take the opportunity, and particularly in response to make it what it would be, what was the second question, what would make this a better place to work, to provide some feedback in a way that is less than positive, particularly directed at individuals. Now, there's not a lot of that, but there's some of that. When I'm working with verbatim responses, one I borrow from the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, right? Very little good comes from putting that out into the public domain. Y'all do have access to the comments, and I think that there's going to be a read. There's already been a read. There'll be more reads of those. And I think it's fair to expect a thematic analysis. What were the major themes? But I want to be cautious around setting an expectation that anybody who's so interested is going to have access to the verbatim responses. That's more than, in most cases, that's not appropriate at this point in the process. We do have some clients who have a long survey history, who have a high trust environment, and they do have a little more latitude in how they treat their verbatims. But where you all are in the process, I would not expect that to be out in the public domain. So in response to the second question, what would make this a better place to work? So among the major themes, so we see lots and lots of comments regarding resource constraints, a lot of frustration directed at the system office and the board and the legislature. So there's a lot of that. There is, the performance management accountability theme that I alluded to. There's more than a handful of examples, certainly enough that got my attention around essentially stories where we're not holding people accountable, or we're not putting the best people in the right roles, right? So there's some accountability themes that are emerged. There's this theme around the communication, right? The communication, again, some of which, not as much as I've seen at other universities in the system regarding communication from and with senior leadership. As I mentioned, y'all's senior leadership scores are among the highest in the system. Doesn't mean there's not things they can do better, but they've got some pretty good things going on. But the communication cross-functionally was another theme that surfaced pretty significantly. Those are a handful. In the interest of time, I'll defer. I'm happy to speak to that more offline, and you'll have an opportunity to do more of that in some form or fashion. The other piece that both of these questions get to, given that y'all haven't done anything like this before, we don't have that roadmap. So if you've got good ideas in terms of how you'd like to see the data sliced, or what would be interesting to you in terms of thematic analysis, I think surface those to Gary and his team. And I think in most cases you'll see a real willingness to work with you when you've got questions, suggestions, or requests like that. Thank you. Other questions, comments, or themes? Questions, comments? Yes, thank you, back here.
Hi,
I'm
I'm
blinded
sorry.
by the light.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I wasn't here when you started, and I was just curious, on a lot of the slides, you had a positive number and a negative number, but they didn't add up to 100%. So does that mean the in-between is people who answered or declined to answer, or they answer neutrally?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I sometimes speak directly to that in the response scale. I didn't today here. So this is essentially a version of top box analysis. So the strongly agree and the agree are captured in that positive response. To your point, if you do the math and you're curious around what the remainder is it the sometimes agree, sometimes disagree, or is it the not applicable? Your colleagues have all the report suites that show the exact response pattern by each response item. In this case, for what you're doing here, it's a reasonable assumption that the majority of that remainder, when you do the math, is going to be in the midpoint. The not applicable is pretty infrequently selected. So for our purposes today, that's a reasonable assumption, and you do have the ability to actually see that response continuum across each of the items, how many strongly agrees versus agrees, et cetera. Good. Good questions. I've got some unsolicited coaching that I'll finish up with, and then I'll pass to Gary for any closing comments or thoughts. So my unsolicited coaching, as you're working with the data and as you're doing potentially some action planning afterwards, the first is be curious. And I mentioned this earlier, right? What can we learn? How does this help us? Come from a place of inquiry. Whether you like it or not, whether you think it's accurate or not, be open to the possibility that it's telling us something that we could benefit or learn from. The second is be solution-oriented. There's no question there's different points of frustration for lots of folks. For some, it's resource constraints. For some, it's a manager who's not providing quite the leadership that a department would like. For others, it may be frustration with not feeling involved in communication or appropriately involved in the decision-making process. So, there's lots of points of frustration. I get that. I'm not saying don't feel that way, but I am encouraging you to be solution-oriented, right? What are you going to do moving forward? And so be curious, be solution-oriented, and the third that occurs to me that I think is really resonant, for me at least, when I look at this data set, is be a partnership mindset. At the end of the day, your all's individual success is linked to your collective success. And when we look at item 58, the sense that we're all on the same team, or some of those other collaboration items around how we cooperate across departments or don't cooperate across departments today, I think there's some opportunity to make some connections, to build some bridges. So as you're working with this moving forward, that would be my three unsolicited coaching tips. Be curious, be solution-oriented, be a partnership mindset. Gary, I will pass to you for anything you want to close us out with.
Well, again, just as a reminder for employees that weren't not able to make this will be online. Please go back and encourage people to look at these results. Jeannie and I are not hard to find, so if you've got questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking, we're happy to try to answer those as best we can. If you've got some thoughts about the data analysis that we ought to look at, we're happy to try to answer those. Again, we've provided a cut to each vice chancellor, and so, for example, I think I see Frank in here, or he was in here for student affairs. He can probably anticipate his vice chancellor asking him to get involved. Others of you in your roles may be asked to do similar things. I think there's a lot to celebrate. There's a lot of good news in these slides. No organization's perfect. We're a busy organization. We're a fast-growing organization. We're an organization dealing in a resource-constrained environment that causes a lot of stress and strain on employees, but also systems. And I think we see some of that reflected in the data too. So I think the session this morning with the cabinet was informative. I think it will spark some other conversations that Phil will want to have, probably one-on-one with his vice chancellors. He may or may not choose to bring us in as a partner to those conversations, but I do fully expect he's going to ask us for some data because I will say, in full disclosure, when you look out across the landscape and you start drilling down, you can see pockets that just sort of jump out and say, I wonder what the deal is there. Intuitively, some of this, I think many of us probably knew or understood, and it's good to have the data to back it up. From a positive perspective, it is useful to the UNC system as they try to advocate with the General Assembly in a difficult political climate for resources, and this gives them data to do that. And so we shouldn't be bashful ever about expressing our opinions. It's a team sport. We're all in this together. This university is a fast-growing university, so we're always going to feel like we don't have as much as we want. or as quick as we need it. But there is a real spirit of collaboration generally across the board in just trying to move this place forward. And so I appreciate you taking the time to show up. And with that, I think we're closed.
Great. I'll be up here if anyone has any questions they want to direct me offline. But thanks for coming, folks. Have a great afternoon. Yeah.